Thanks, Lee. Real quick, since we moved this mic, if you're on Zoom, can you just let me know if you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. All right. So I already introduced myself, but I'm Keith, again at WashU School of Medicine in St. Louis. This kind of kickoff talk is called "What is Data Science and Are You Already Doing It?" Because one of the things that we talked about, I think was a common theme through a lot of introductions, was like a little bit of imposter syndrome. And most of us were probably pretty good students. If you're like me, you crave external validation in your professional life. So first, what is data science? It's a big field. And if we look at a few different definitions online, for instance, on the IBM website, they say data science combines math and statistics, specialized programming, advanced analytics and artificial intelligence, and machine learning with specific subject matter expertise to uncover actionable insights hidden in an organization's data. And I've sort of color-coded, the things that you use in blue there with the goal in green, and then what you actually do it to, right, in red. Now, that's pretty broad though, right? So we use math and statistics, programming, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and subject matter expertise. Pretty wide net. If we look at Wikipedia, it says data science is an interdisciplinary academic field that uses statistics, scientific computing, scientific methods, processes, algorithms, and systems, again, pretty broad terms, to extract or extrapolate knowledge and insights from noisy, structured, and unstructured data. So kind of the goal is, we're trying to get insight from data is pretty straightforward, but otherwise, this is very unhelpful, I would say. So I don't actually think it's really useful to think about like, what is data science? Maybe that's a fun philosophical question you can have sometime. But I prefer to think of this as what skills does a data scientist need? And I really like to think about things in terms of skills and abilities because I grew up watching Transformers and playing with action figures that on the back side of the box had these helpful guides that showed you the relative strength, intelligence, speed, endurance, various character attributes of the different Transformers. That makes it clear that Optimus Prime is the leader of the Autobots. He's maxing out pretty much every category. Whereas Bumblebee is, he's smaller, he's wily, he has to get by with his speed and his intelligence. He's not as powerful as Optimus Prime. If you didn't watch Transformers, maybe you played Dungeons and Dragons, and that intelligence is the primary character stat for a wizard, but strength and constitution is going to be much more valuable if you're a barbarian. Or, right, if you're a fan of My Little Pony, that if Fluttershy is much more quiet and reserved, whereas somebody like Twilight Sparkle has a much more outgoing personality. I think this is fine. This is great. We need lots of different strengths and weaknesses to complement each other and kind of fill in those gaps. So that's one of the other things to think about. Data science, right, is as broad as the universe of My Little Pony, right, as broad as the universe of 1980s cartoons, and you can't necessarily be all those things. So you have to think a little bit about, okay, what are the things that I really want to be or the things that I really need to be? And then hopefully you can find somebody that has complementary skill sets. So if we think about these skill sets, I did a very informal search of LinkedIn data science jobs. And that broadly falls into three different categories. You can be a data engineer, a data scientist, or a data analyst. And then again, I very informally distilled the necessary traits down to these cardinal dimensions, and then kind of ranked where they stack for these different job ads. So for instance, if you see job ads for somebody who's a data engineer, you often need a much deeper knowledge of the actual hardware on which a system is running. How data are stored becomes really important, but you are still probably branching out into AI and ML workflows, and you may be writing some programs that your company or your organization is going to use, largely in the management of unstructured data and bringing it in and storing it so that it can be used for people in the future. If you look at data scientist job postings, it's a little bit different. There's a much greater reduction on actually managing the hardware or the data storage infrastructure, but there's a lot of emphasis on software development. If you see a job posting for a data scientist, there is a large expectation that you're going to take all of that data that the data engineers are pulling in, and you're actually going to turn it into a usable format. But critically, you're writing software to do that. And so your ability to wrangle data or take things from kind of their wild, unstructured shape into something a little more workable is really critical. And there are a lot of different languages that you might use to do that, but especially being able to work with things on the cloud, right, is an important skill in this arena, because usually the type of data that you're working with is too big for even a quite good desktop computer or quite good laptop computer to really meaningfully compute all that stuff. If you look at data analyst jobs, which is probably the closest to my background and training as a statistician in academia, there's a much greater emphasis on the lower part of our radar plot here. So you need to know a lot about data analysis, which is a pretty vague term, again, but a lot of different things you can do with data analysis. But AI and machine learning maybe is a little reduced relative to some more traditional statistics. Data visualization becomes a lot more important. And actually, I think your written and oral communication become a little more important in this role as well, because a key thing that data analysts are often asked to do is to take the data that the data engineers have pulled from all of the various sources, the data scientists have cleaned up and put into a workable format, but then somebody who actually works in a specific division, right, of a company or for a particular research question says, hey, we want to know, if people watch this movie, what other kinds of movies did they watch, right? If you work at Netflix. Or we want to know how long people are actually spending on their notes, right, in the EHR, and how can we optimize that process, maybe if you work in a hospital. And the data analyst then has to work on, well, how do I operationalize that question? And how do I find that answer? So you're usually working kind of on data on the back end, hopefully getting closer to that insight step. But a lot of people have worked with the data before you. And data science is a little buzzwordy, but I think it connotes this big data idea, which I would say is also a little buzzwordy. So big data is great, but small data are also great. In fact, probably no one in this room really works with truly big data. How big are big data? That's a hard question to answer. Again, it's a fun philosophical debate you can have online with all of the really nice people on Reddit. But this is the one plot that I like to use, where it's a little bit older now. I think this is from 2021, but this is in petabytes. So that's 1,000 terabytes or 1,000,000 gigabytes. And this dashed line represents 1 petabyte down here. I don't think I've generated 1 petabyte worth of data in my life. I don't think I've touched a petabyte of data in total, if you count every project I've ever been involved in. But if you work in neuroimaging or if you are in that more sort of data engineering world, it's feasible that you might start to approach this line. But big data is like the CERN Hadron Collider. It's Amazon Web Services. It's Netflix. So most of us aren't ever going to touch big data. But critically, right, I think that's fine. Most research data are not big. In fact, there's this great paper by Ferguson and colleagues in Nature Neuroscience on the long tail of what they call small data, with the idea that in research, we have some organized big data sets. Things like the genome, right, has a natural structure to it. So it's easy to archive and integrate thousands of different genomes. The brain doesn't totally have a natural structure to it, but you can chop it up into, a bunch of millimeter by millimeter voxels, give those X, Y, and Z coordinates. And I'm glossing over a lot of details of spatial physics, but you can kind of then, harmonize a bunch of brains and align them together. I got to look at Dave and JB and say, that's an easy process. I am sure. but again, those would be really big data in the research field. As you move out from that, right, the data gets smaller and smaller, but that's okay, because data skills and your ability to work with data and having the facility to process data is useful for everyone. Even if, God help you, you open it up in Excel on your screen and it converts all of your numbers into dates, and then you have to try to undo that, right? Like there are things that you can do in a programmatic way that are going to make your workflow more accurate because Excel won't convert it into dates. It'll be more reproducible because if you have code, you can hand it off to the next person and be confident that they're going to be the exact same answer that you did. And it will often be faster because a lot of the problems that we encounter in research are a lot like problems that we encountered last year, right? And so if I have my undergrad RA do it, that's a problem because they graduated. Now I have to train a new undergrad RA and they'll probably make some mistakes, right? Not because undergrad RAs are bad, but because human beings make mistakes. Whereas if I have code to solve my problem, I can just copy and paste it, right? Maybe change some variable names. And now I can do the same thing in a couple of minutes that might have taken my undergrad RAs weeks. And I think this is important, this like notion of structure and reproducibility, but it's also really easy to let it slip away. And so to illustrate that, let's talk about a data ecosystem, the whole kind of life cycle of data in a project. And this might make more sense to you if you are a little later in your academic career, but if you're early in your research career, just trust me, this is how a lot of stuff works. But let's say you've got a lab. You have that one computer that's not connected to the internet so that Windows doesn't update because your software only runs on an older version of Windows, and you save data on that computer. Now, you will back up some of that data on the web or the server, or it used to be a series of external hard drives, and some of those data are just going to be lost forever. It's going to happen. Like IT will be updating the server when you happen to be trying to save it, and something's going to go wrong. So we'll lose some data there, but with the data you have backed up on the web, what you'll do is you'll start going through and formatting and cleaning it. Some errors might be detected when you bring this to your PI and you're like, oh, this formula was wrong. I need you to go back. So data will get formatted, reformatted, and re-cleaned. Oops, you did the analysis on the wrong data file to start with, so you got to go back and do that again. Eventually, you'll do the analysis on the right data exactly the way you want. You'll submit it to a journal. The reviewer comments are going to require new analyses. So you have to go back to the data. It might involve reformatting and re-cleaning to get new variables to do what the reviewers want. And then you find that, okay, you have to actually switch to a non-parametric analysis. So you're going to create some new figures. And finally, you might get this published and you think it's done. This project is out of your mind forever. And then 5 years later, someone says, hey, I'm doing a meta-analysis. Can I have your data? And you'll go into your folder and you'll see, okay, should I send them the one that says final or the one that says final underscore revised? That says final underscore revised, but has a newer date. Like, which one do I do? But if you can actually align all of this and plan it out in advance, you can have not a delicate, fragile ecosystem, but you can actually have a robust ecosystem where things move relatively smoothly. It's never perfectly smooth, but relatively smoothly from collecting data to storing it in a secure location, a relatively permanent location, to the actual wrangling of those data, cleaning it up from its rough format into something that's kind of purpose-built and ready for use, to the actual analyses and data visualizations that you might make, to then actually communicating this. And we'll talk about kind of different levels at which this can be done, fully reproducible and implementable publications, open access data repositories, and then also the more sort of human side of this stuff in terms of press or questions you might get at conferences. But again, the cleaner and more reproducible this process is the whole way through, the easier all of these downstream steps become. So that's a pretty broad overview of things that we might start to tackle in repro rehab and things about data science. But one of the things I want to impress upon you is that the typical PhD student, or I just expand this to say maybe repro rehab learner, since not everyone's a PhD student, has more data science skills than you probably already think. We don't think of ourselves as data sciencey, and many of us are like, well, I never officially learned to program, right? But we have something. We've got something to go on. And repro rehab can then help you decide where you want to grow your pie chart. The one thing I would say is don't try to grow it in all directions at once. That's probably not feasible. Think about your project and what you need the most. And you might have computer sciencey growth where, okay, are you collecting a lot of physiological signals and you need to write some software to your lab to help integrate and harmonize signals from different sources, maybe clean those different signals. Do you want more sort of big data growth, right? Like, are you collecting biomechanics data at 1,000 hertz from a bunch of different positional sensors for a bunch of different participants doing a bunch of different tasks, right? Or are you getting into neuroimaging data and you need to learn the standards for actual reproducible neuroimaging analyses? All of these things are going to be things you can start to develop in Repro Rehab. Or finally, right, like you might have some analytics-y goals where you really want to work on your data visualization, or you want to work on some advanced statistical analyses and how to implement them in these different languages. So you can kind of pick these different directions in a choose your own adventure with Repro Rehab. So as you're listening to the different talks and kind of figuring out where you want to go through the first crash course part of Repro Rehab, really think about where you need to grow or want to grow so that you can implement that when you get to the self-driven part of Repro Rehab. So next, I've got the sort of why is it Repro Rehab and not like data science rehab part of my talk. But any interim questions, I guess? Yeah.
We get a copy of the slides.
Oh yeah, you can definitely get a copy of the slides. I don't know if they're on our GitHub or not, but anyway. Yeah. Well,
we're recording this time.
And
first time ever.
Oh, okay. I didn't know this was the official version.
Yeah, okay, no, this is it.
So yeah, they should be online through the GitHub, I think, or if not, just email me and I'll send it to you too. Any other questions? Yes.
The ecosystem slide.
Yeah. Oh, I had so many animations. Like this one?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand what's the difference between using and communicating.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say using is more just sort of an internal process, for you as the researcher. So like when I'm running my analyses and I might be doing the quality assurance part to make sure my analysis ran correctly, I would sort of put that under the using step. Or if I'm, visualizing my data, so I get a sense of, the distributions of the data, maybe making sure that it meets certain assumptions. I would kind of put that under the using step. Whereas when I'm like writing up my analysis or trying to think about how can I visualize these data to clearly communicate the message to an outside audience, I'd put that under the communicating step. But it's probably a little bit of a gray area, not a hard and fast box. Yeah. I can probably finish in 10 minutes. Okay. All right. So why is it Repro Rehab and not like data science rehab? So one of the things I want to emphasize here is this notion of reproducibility. So you may or may not know, but the earliest computers were actually people. That was a job title, was being a computer. You were a human computer. They were actually often women, interestingly enough, with degrees in math or physics. And their job was to do difficult calculations by hand. But you had to have a person who had sufficient training that you could hand them the equations and say, all right, here's the starting values, do all the calculations, for these 1,000 different situations and do all that processing. So Katherine Johnson was actually one of the early human computers at NASA, and later helped pioneer the process of bringing in digital computers that replace human computers over time. And the reason why we like digital computers is that it is much easier to give a computer an algorithm, right, than give it some input, and then it will produce the same output out the other end. So there's nothing wrong fundamentally with having a human computer take data, do calculations manually, and get the output. Science has worked and progressed that way for most of the lifetime of science, right? But that's time intensive, it's prone to errors, and if you give that same data to someone else, they have to start from scratch to do it all again. Whereas if we have a code-based calculation, whether that's in MATLAB, Python, or R, You can just give somebody your code, them your starting data, and they can just hit run and see if they get the same result or not. And if they do, great. If they don't, then that might be a bit of a problem, right? And it suggests we need to do some troubleshooting to figure out why we're getting discrepant results. And speaking of discrepant results, I like to define a few different terms here that are reproducibility, replicability, robustness, and generalizability. So if I have some set of data and I give you my code to run it and you can get the same results, then it's reproducible, right? We can see that we get the same answer given the same input. That is distinct in science from replicability, which is an issue of, can I go get like a new sample, run the same experiment, and then get the same result in a different sample of people? That is great if that happens, but that's a different problem. Because one of the things is, if I take a new sample of people, just by chance, I might get a different answer, right? There's no guarantee that we'll get the exact same correlation value or the exact same difference between two groups in one sample of data versus another sample of data. And then we can take this a step further, because if we have the same data, but someone else analyzes it in a slightly different way, like somebody says, well, I would really include this as a covariate. Or somebody says, I don't really think we should treat these data as interval, like let's say it's the pain scale. You should do your data using a cumulative link logit model, because those are ordinal data. If we can basically get the same result, regardless of our different approaches, then that's robust. And that's great, because the result is bigger than kind of the underlying assumptions that go into any one model. And finally, the best situation is if it is generalizable. If somebody can go take a new sample of data and they can actually analyze the data in a slightly different way, but we still kind of come to a converging conclusion, now we're getting some real scientific consensus on what the answer to our question is. And we know that it's generalizable and robust across different contexts. And that's really important. I think that's the thing we're ultimately sort of striving for in a lot of scientific research. But that's not fundamentally in our control, right? If someone has different assumptions and it changes the results, that's interesting. Maybe it's scientifically meaningful, and maybe it sparks new questions. Why did we get one answer in this context, but a different answer in this context? Or if someone replicates or tries to replicate our experiment and we got a statistically significant result, they don't get a statistically significant result. It may be that one of us was right, one of us was wrong. It may be that the real answer is it's somewhere in the middle. But again, it's just fundamentally not something under our control. So I'm a big believer in controlling the controllable, which is why it's really important to focus on reproducibility, because that is something we can control. We can make sure that our data are well structured. We can make sure that our code is well commented and clean. And when we pass that off to somebody else, they get the same answer that we do. So that I'm summarizing some things to skip over these slides. This is basically the longer form version of what I just said. And that's why we want to focus on reproducibility. So if we can actually build more reproducibility into rehabilitation science, then the great thing is we have a lot more confidence in our research moving forward. And science is inherently messy, right? We explore a lot of ideas and they don't fundamentally work out. So in order to make that process as efficient as possible, we need to make sure that we're reducing research waste and really being able to make sure that our original answers are correct. And the best way to do that is to make sure that other people can get the same answer that we do. So that's why we focus on reproducibility and making it repro rehab. Thank you.